The old ones laughed the moment the human ship limped into their sky, because in 9 million years nothing had ever made them laugh before. Keeper Olof Ve watched it come on the deep screens of the stillhold, and felt something move in the long quiet of its mind that it did not have a word for. The thing crawling toward the world below was a ruin. It was patched. It was wrong. Half its hull was the gray rock of an asteroid, still pocked with the drill scars of some mine, and the other half was bolted metal, welded plate over plate, like a beggar's coat, sewn from the clothes of the dead. It leaked light from 100 seams. It limped on engines that flickered like a dying coal, and behind it, it dragged a faint shimmer of vented air, as though the ship were slowly bleeding out across the whole approach. Olof Ve had seen empires rise. It had seen them fall. It had outlasted 3 galaxies of small, hot, hurrying things that all believed they would be the ones to last. It remembered the Wind, who had built rings of light around 40 suns and called themselves eternal, and it remembered filing the last of them in a drawer 200 meters below the stillhold floor. It remembered the Coral, who came in ships of living crystal and screamed promises into the dark for 1,000 years before they fell silent. It remembered all of them, every species that had ever raised a hand against the patient gray world, and it remembered them only because remembering was the one thing the Stillkeepers did better than anything else that had ever lived. And now a single broken stone was dragging itself toward the homeworld of the Stillkeepers, and Olof Ve, who had not spoken aloud in 200,000 years, let a thin sound escape its long throat. It was a laugh, the first laugh in the stillhold since before the human species had stood upright. Below decks, on that very ship, a 15-year-old named Petra Quill was being sick into a bucket. She had never wanted to be here. She had signed on to the hauler when it was still a hauler, the rock tug Bramwell's Patience, because feeding 8 younger siblings on a tin colony meant you took the first berth that did not ask your age too closely. She had told them she was 17. The recruiting clerk had looked at her and looked at the line of younger faces behind her on the colony dock and written down 17 without a word, because he had a sister once too, and that was how it went out on the rim. She had spent 2 years learning to move ore through the great gut of the ship. Then the war found them, the way weather finds a roof, and somebody in a uniform decided that a tug big enough to haul a mountain was big enough to carry guns. They cut the cargo holds into magazines. They welded armor over the ore chutes. They tore out the grav conveyors that had moved 1,000 tons of rock a day and left only the heavy spine of the old machinery, because there was no time to strip it clean. They called it a warship and gave it a number, and the number was all the name the fleet ever bothered with. The number was 140C. Petra had never once heard anyone say it out loud. The crew gave it a different name. They painted it on the inside of the main lift, where no officer ever looked. They called her the Slow Mercy, because she was the slowest ship in the line, and because Mercy was the last thing anyone expected her to deliver. Somebody had painted a small crude flower under the name, nobody knew who, and over 2 years the flower had become a kind of luck. You touched it on your way to your station. Petra touched it every shift. She touched it now, on her way past the lift, with a hand that would not stop shaking. She wiped her mouth and stood up. The deck under her boots was shaking in a way decks were not supposed to shake. She was a powder runner now, which meant when the guns fired, she carried what the guns ate, and she ran it from the magazine to the breech faster than a girl her size should be able to run anything. Her hands were already burned in 4 places from the last engagement, 3 weeks ago, over a moon nobody would ever name, where the Slow Mercy had taken on a Stillkeeper picket and lost 9 of her crew and learned for the first time what the patient guns did to metal. She was the youngest person aboard by 3 years, and everyone treated her like a kind of pet, and she had stopped minding, because being a pet meant the older ones tried very hard to keep you alive. The intercom crackled. A voice came through it, dry and unhurried, the voice of a man who had decided a long time ago that panic was a luxury he could not afford. All hands, this is the captain. We have arrived. Captain Edric Hale had a face like a closed door and a record that the fleet whispered about in 2 directions at once. Some said he had never lost a ship. Others said he had lost so many that he had stopped counting, and that the ones he lost were the price of the ones he saved. Both things were true. He had been flying since before the war had a name, hauling first, then fighting, then commanding, and he had buried more crews than any officer in the fleet, and brought more home than any officer in the fleet, and the two numbers, the buried and the brought home, were the only arithmetic he had ever trusted. He stood on the bridge of the Slow Mercy, with his hands folded behind his back, and watched the world ahead of them fill the screen, and he did not blink. The world was called, in the human charts, only by a string of numbers, because no human had ever spoken to anything that lived there. It was old. You could see that it was old. It had no oceans and no clouds and no green. Its whole surface was a single carved structure, a skin of gray stone cities grown over and into each other across ages, layer upon layer, until the planet was less a world than a single building the size of a world. Lights moved in its canyons like slow blood. It turned beneath them with a heaviness that felt deliberate, as though it could have stopped if it wished, and simply chose to continue. The sensors said the structure went down 40 kilometers into the crust before it hit anything that had not been carved, and even then they were not sure, because the readings came back wrong, came back old, as though the very stone resented being measured by something that would be dead before the measuring was done. Petra knew none of that. Petra knew only that the ship had been falling towards something for 9 months, that the journey had been the strangest of her life. 40 systems crossed in the dark, with the engines kept low, escort ships appearing and vanishing around them, whole fleets dying somewhere over the horizon to keep the stillkeepers from looking too closely at one slow tug. She had asked once early on where they were going, and Pharaoh had looked at her with his one eye and said, "Only somewhere that's never been afraid, and we're going to teach it how." She had thought it was one of his jokes. She did not think so anymore. Now, 3 decks down in the gut of the ship, she felt the deck shake with the nearness of the place they had crossed a war to reach, and she pressed her burned hands flat against a bulkhead, and she waited, the way the whole ship waited, for the thing she did not yet understand to begin. Around it hung the fleet of the Stillkeepers. There were 900 ships, and not one of them was less than 40 kilometers long. They did not glitter, they did not bristle, they hung in the dark like the teeth of something that had been asleep for a very long time and had only now decided to open its mouth. They were patient ships, built by patient minds, and the patience came off them in waves that the human sensors could not measure, but every human aboard could somehow feel. A pressure behind the eyes, a certainty that you were small and brief and already half forgotten. On the bridge, Taller, the first officer, found that he had stopped breathing and made himself start again, and noticed that everyone else on the bridge had done the same thing at the same moment. Keeper Oloth Ve considered the broken ship for a long time before it spoke. It was in the nature of the Stillkeepers to consider things for a long time. They had learned across 9 million years that almost every problem solved itself if you simply waited, that the angry grew tired, that the bright grew dim, that the fast grew slow, and that a patient mind that did nothing at all would, more often than not, outlast the need to do anything. So Oloth Ve watched the ship come, and it weighed the ship against everything it had ever filed, and it placed the ship, provisionally, in the drawer marked for the brief and the doomed, the drawer that held 140,000 species, the largest drawer there was. The ship would go in that drawer. Everything went in that drawer eventually. The only question was how long it would take, and the answer, Oloth Ve judged, was not long. The ship was already dying. You could see it dying. It leaked. It limped. It would not last the night. There was no need to even fire upon it. There was only a need to wait, and to be, perhaps, a little kind, because kindness cost nothing, and the Stillkeepers could afford to be generous with the brief, the way the old are generous with children who do not know how short their summer is. A signal came across the void. It was not a threat. That was the worst part. It was an offer, and it was almost gentle. The translator on the bridge turned it into human words, and the words filled the speaker soft and slow, like a grandparent speaking to a child who has wandered somewhere dangerous. "Small thing," the Stillkeepers said. "Broken thing. You have come a long way to die. Turn around. Go home, live the little while that you are given. We will not even remember that you were here." On the bridge, nobody answered. Captain Hale unfolded his hands. He looked at the 900 ancient ships, and the world the size of a building, and the soft and patient voice that had outlived the birth of stars. Then he looked at his own crew, the tired and the burned and the young, the ones who had crossed half the war to reach this place, and he said one thing: "Open a channel back." The channel opened. "We didn't come to die," Hale said, "and we didn't come to go home. We came because you took a colony of ours, 11,000 people, off a rock that wasn't even yours. You cataloged them, you filed them, you're holding them somewhere down in all that stone like coins in a drawer." He paused. "Give them back, and we leave. Keep them, and you find out what this broken thing came here to do." The Stillkeepers were silent for a moment. And then, across 900 ships and one whole world, they did the thing they had not done in the memory of any living mind. They laughed. The laughter was the worst sound Petra Quill had ever heard, and she had heard a magazine cook-off with two men still inside it. It came up through the deck, not through the speakers. It came through the structure of the world itself, a vibration in the ancient stone that the human sensors picked up and could not stop picking up, a sound 900 ships wide and a planet deep. It was not cruel. That was the thing that made her hands shake on the powder cart. It was amused. It was the gentle, helpless laughter of an old thing watching a child swing a wooden sword at the sea. It went on for a long time. It went on long enough that some of the magazine crew put their hands over their ears, and it did not help, because the sound was not in the air. It was in the bones of the ship and the bones of the people inside her. She gripped the cart and made herself breathe. Around her, the magazine crew were doing the same. There was a gunner named Roz, a big slow woman from a heavy world who could lift a shell that took two normal people, and she put one hand flat on the bulkhead and said quietly, "Let them laugh. My grandmother laughed at me once, when I said I'd leave that world and never haul rock again. I outlived her. I've been hauling rock ever since, but I outlived her." It was not really a joke, and it was not really a comfort, but Roz said it in her flat, heavy world voice, and somehow it helped anyway, the way it helps when the strongest person in the room is not running. Petra looked at Rose and did not say anything, because her throat was too tight, but she moved a little closer to the big woman, the way she had learned to do in the last engagement, and Rose let her, the way she had learned to let her. That was how the magazine crew worked. Nobody talked about being afraid. Everybody moved a little closer to the next person, and the closeness did the talking. There were 26 of them down here in the gut of the ship, and over 2 years they had become a thing that was not quite a family and not quite a crew but had the strongest parts of both. And Petra, who had left a real family of 8 on a tin colony to feed them, had found a second one in the dark, among the rock and the shell carts and the smell of oil. She thought of her brothers and sisters now, far away, asleep under a different sky, and she thought, with the strange, clear calm that comes over a person when the worst is close, that she would like very much to see them again, and that she might not, and that holding both of those things at once was simply what it was to be alive on a warship. Up on the bridge, Captain Hale waited until the laughter died. It took a long time. The Stillkeepers were in no hurry. They had never been in a hurry about anything. When the sound finally faded, the soft voice came back, and now there was something new under the gentleness, something that had been buried so long it had nearly fossilized. It was curiosity. "You amuse us," the Stillkeeper said. "Do you know how rare that is? We have catalogued 140,000 species. We have outlived all but a few hundred of them. They came to us angry, as you have come, and they all said the same things you have said. Give us back what is ours, or learn what we came here to do. And then we filed them, small thing, the way we will file you, in a drawer in the stone, and the galaxy turned, and no one remembered their names." A pause, like a long, slow breath. "We are the Stillkeepers. We do not conquer. We do not hate. We simply outlast. We have outlasted everything. We will outlast you before this rotation of our world is complete." Hale listened to all of it without moving. When it was done, He turned to his first officer, a wiry man named Toller who had been with him longer than anyone, and he said, in a voice the channel could not hear, "They like to talk." "They've had a long time to get good at it," Toller said. "Long time to get used to talking instead of fighting." Hale looked at the gray world. "When was the last time anything actually made them bleed, do you think?" Toller checked the readings. The 900 ships had not moved. They had not powered weapons. They were simply waiting, certain, the way a landslide is certain, for the small broken thing to exhaust itself. "I don't think they remember," Toller said. "Look at the picket pattern. It's wrong. It's beautiful, but it's wrong. They've got 900 ships in a formation that hasn't had to actually stop anything in so long that it's become a decoration. They're not guarding, they're displaying. Like a fence around a garden nobody's tried to climb in 100,000 years." He swallowed. "I don't think they can be hurt, Captain. I don't think it's in their doctrine anymore. I don't think they have a doctrine anymore. They have a habit." Hale almost smiled. "Almost. Good," he said. In the stillhold, far below, on the gray world that was a building, Keeper Olaf Ve listened to the small broken thing refuse to die, and felt the unfamiliar movement in its mind grow stronger. It had a name for the movement now. It had gone down into the deep drawers of its own memory, the oldest layers, the ones it had not opened since the early ages, and it had found the word. The word was unease. Olaf Ve had not felt unease in so long that it had forgotten the feeling had a shape. It turned the small broken ship over and over in its thoughts, the way a very old creature turns a strange stone it has found, and it could not place it. Every species the Still Keepers had ever outlasted, every one of the 140,000, had behaved in ways the catalog could predict. They threatened, they bargained, they wept, they ran. The catalog had a drawer for each of those, and 100,000 drawers besides, and in all of them the ending was the same, because the ending was always the same, because patience was the one thing none of them had. And here was a thing that did not threaten the way the catalog expected, did not bargain, did not weep, did not run, but came on, slow and broken and certain, toward a world it could not take, making a sound from before there were weapons. Olaf Ve searched the catalog for a drawer to put it in, and for the first time in 9 million years, it could not find one. There was no drawer. The small thing did not fit anywhere in the memory of the galaxy, and a creature that has spent 9 million years believing it, has seen everything, finds nothing more frightening than the thing it has no drawer for. He keyed the channel again. "You said you don't conquer," he said to the patient, ancient voice. "You said you outlast. So you've never actually had to win a fight, have you? You just wait until the thing fighting you gets old and dies. You wait until empires forget why they were angry. You've never been hit by something that doesn't have time to forget." He let that sit. "We've got 11,000 reasons not to forget, and we built this ship for exactly one purpose. And what purpose is that, small thing?" "To be the one that doesn't wait," Hale said, and he closed the channel. He turned to his bridge crew. Every face was on him. They had followed this man across a war to a world that laughed at them, and they were afraid, all of them, and they were waiting for him to give the fear somewhere to go. "Listen to me," Hale said, and his voice was not loud, but it filled the bridge. "That thing out there has never been wrong. In 9 million years it has never once been wrong. It has outlasted everyone who ever raised a hand to it, because everyone who ever raised a hand to it was made of meat and pride, and they ran out of both before the Still Keepers ran out of patience." He walked to the front of the bridge, to the screen, to the gray world hanging there. "But we are not here to outlast them. We came here knowing we can't. We brought something that doesn't care about time at all." There was a thing the crew did not know about Captain Edric Hale, and he had never told them, and he never would, and it was the reason he had been chosen for this, above every other captain in the fleet. He had been there, 20 years before, on a different ship, when the second mantle charge tore its hull apart before it could fire. He had watched it happen from a tender 200 kilometers away, watched a good ship and a good crew come apart holding a force no metal could hold, and he had spent 20 years afterward thinking about why, and the answer he had reached was the answer that had brought him here. The ship had failed because it had tried to hold the force the way a strong thing holds, all at once, rigid, refusing, and a force like the mantle could not be refused. It could only be carried, the way old stone carried itself, the way patience carried itself, by being older and deeper and more stubborn than the thing it held. He had spent 20 years learning the one lesson the Stillkeepers had built their whole civilization on, and tonight he was going to use it to break them, and the bitter, perfect justice of that was a thing he kept entirely to himself. He turned around. Spin up the mantle. Petra, 3 decks down, heard the order come through the intercom and felt the ship change. She had been aboard the Slow Mercy for 2 years. She knew her sounds the way she knew her own pulse. She knew the cough of the patched engines and the groan of the welded plate, and the rattle of the old ore conveyors they had never fully torn out, and she knew, the way you know a stranger has entered your home in the dark, that there was a part of this ship she had never heard before, and it had just woken up. It started as a hum. It came from the center of the ship, from the great hollow gut where the ore holds had been, the part that had been sealed off and guarded since the day she came aboard, the part that even the officers did not enter. There was a door down there, 3 decks below the magazine, with a single armed guard on it at all times, and in 2 years Petra had never seen it open. The crew called the space behind it the quiet hold, and they did not joke about it the way they joked about everything else, and now Petra understood why. The hum came from the quiet hold. It climbed. It was not the sound of an engine. It was the sound of something being wound, a tension being built, a coil of force tightening turn by turn into a knot the size of the ship's whole heart. In the magazine, Roz looked at the bulkhead. "What is that?" she said. A voice answered. It was the chief gunner, an old man named Pharaoh, with a metal jaw and 1 real eye, who had been on the Slow Mercy since before it was a warship and knew everything there was to know about it. He had been quiet the whole engagement, sitting on an ammunition crate with his hands folded, and now he spoke without looking up. "That," Pharaoh said, "is why they let a rust bucket like us come all this way." Petra stared at him. "What do you mean?" Pharaoh looked at her with his one eye. He had a way of looking that made you feel like he had already watched you grow old. "You think the fleet sent the slowest ship in the line on the longest journey in the war by accident, girl?" He shook his head slowly. "You think they spent 9 months routing 1 half-dead tug across 40 systems, burning escorts to keep her hidden, losing good ships to keep the Stillkeepers from looking at her too hard, because she was expendable? No, they didn't send the Slow Mercy because she was worth nothing. They sent her because she's the only hull big enough and old enough to carry the thing in her belly. The rest of the fleet's out there fighting the war the normal way, dying the normal way. We carried the other thing. The thing we only build 1 of, because building 2 would be a sin." "What thing?" Petra whispered. Pharaoh stood up. His knees cracked. He put a hand on her shoulder, and for once there was no joke in his ruined face. "A mantle charge," he said. "There's only ever been 1 fired before tonight, and it was a test, on a dead moon nobody wanted, on the far edge of a dead system, and the moon isn't there anymore. Not broken, not cratered. Gone. The whole moon, 400 kilometers of rock, just stopped being. They put a second one in a ship after that, a real warship, the best hull they had, and the ship couldn't take the strain. It tore itself apart before it could fire. The force the mantle makes when it's winding up wants to come out in every direction, and any ship made of metal flies to pieces holding it." He squeezed her shoulder. "So they needed a hull that was mostly rock to start with. A hull that could hold a force that wants to come apart, because the rock was already used to holding itself together against everything the universe could throw for 4.5 billion years. That's us, girl. We're the cradle. We were never a warship. We're a cradle for 1 terrible child, and we carried it across the whole war so the captain could put it down a throat that's never been afraid of anything." The hum climbed higher. The deck plates began to sing. Up on the bridge, the readings on the mantle's coil were rising, slow and steady, like a tide. Hale watched the number climb and did not rush it. You did not rush a thing like this. Toller stood beside him, pale, watching the same number. "They're hailing again," Toller said. "Put it through." The soft voice came back, and for the first time, there was a thread in it that had not been there before. It was small. It was almost nothing. But Hale had spent his whole life listening for exactly this, in the voices of things that thought they could not lose. "Small thing," the Stillkeepers said. "What is that sound you are making?" Hale leaned toward the channel. "You said you outlast everything," he said. "You said nothing has ever made you bleed, so you've never heard this sound before." "Of course you haven't. The only things that ever made it are dead, and you filed them and you forgot their names." He looked at the gray world turning beneath him, the world that was a building, the drawer of stone where 11,000 of his people were being kept like coins. "But you're going to remember ours. You cannot harm us," the Stillkeepers said, and there it was again, that small new thread. 900 ships, a world that has stood since before your sun. You are one broken stone. "I know," Hale said. "That's all we need." He turned to his weapons officer, a young woman named Idris who had her hands flat on the firing board and sweat on her lip. "How long?" "The coil wants 4 more minutes to reach the floor it'll fire from," Idris said. "But Captain, the strain readings on the hull, we're already past the cradle's rated load." "The rock's holding, but if we hold full charge much longer than the firing window, the ship starts coming apart around it. The mantle doesn't care that we're the cradle. It wants out either way. Every second past the window, we lose a margin we don't get back." "Then we don't hold it long," Hale said. "We aim and we let it go." Down in the magazine, Petra felt the singing in the deck change pitch, climbing towards something her teeth could feel. Pharaoh had gone to the magazine wall and put both hands against it, the way you might hold a wall in an earthquake, except the wall was the one shaking and he was trying to steady it. "What do we do?" Petra asked him. "There's no shells for this. There's nothing for us to run. We're powder runners, and there's no powder to run." Pharaoh laughed, short and rough. "No, girl, the mantle doesn't eat powder. The only thing left for us to run is ourselves." He looked at her, and then at all of them, the whole magazine crew, 26 people who had thought their war tonight would be carrying shells. "When she fires, this ship is going to try to die. Every weld, every old seam, every place we patched her, it's all going to want to let go at once. The force leaves through her body on its way out. For about 11 seconds, the slow mercy is going to be a thing being torn in half from the inside, and the only reason she won't come apart is if there are people standing on every break before it breaks." He pointed at a row of heavy hand-cranked clamps along the spine of the ship, old ore conveyor brakes they had never removed. "Those, the conveyor brakes. We never tore them out because there was never time, and tonight that's the only reason any of us live. We man those. Every one of us. We become the thing that holds her together when she wants to come apart. That's the job. That was always the job. The fleet didn't send a magazine crew. They sent a crew of hands strong enough to hold a ship together for 11 seconds and dumb enough to do it." The hum became a roar. The number on the bridge climbed toward the floor it would fire from, and 900 ancient ships, for the first time in 9 million years, began very slowly to move. The Stillkeepers had not moved in a war in 400,000 years, and the movement was clumsy, the way a giant who has slept too long stands clumsily, but there were 900 of them, and they were each 40 kilometers of patient stone. Keeper Oloth Ve gave the order from the stillhold, and it gave the order the way it did everything, slowly, certain there was time. There was always time. Time was the only weapon the Stillkeepers had ever needed, because everything that had ever come for them was made of hurry, and hurry burned out, and patience did not. The small broken thing would burn out too. It was only making a noise. Noise was what small things did before the quiet took them. Oloth Ve had heard the noise of the wind and the coral and 100,000 others, the noise of the brief and the angry, and it had filed every one of them in the stone below, and the stone did not care, and Oloth Ve did not care, and the world turned, and that was how it had always gone. But the noise was wrong. Oloth Ve had heard the death songs of 100,000 species. It knew the sounds that hurrying things made when they thought they could win. This was not that sound. This was lower. This was older. This was a sound that did not seem to belong to a thing that lived a short life and knew it. It was the sound of force being folded back on itself, past the point where force was supposed to fold, and some deep part of Olaf Vey's 9 million-year mind, a part it had not used since before it learned to laugh, recognized that sound and was afraid. It was the sound the universe itself made, very rarely, when a star died wrong or when something fell into a place that should not exist. It was not a weapon sound. It was a sound from before there were weapons, and the small broken thing was making it on purpose. It pushed the fear down. It was the still keepers. It did not feel fear. Fear was for the brief. For the first time in 400,000 years, Olaf Vey gave an order that was not a habit. It had to reach down into the oldest layers of itself to find how, because giving a fighting order was a thing the still keepers had not truly done since the early ages, since before they learned that waiting was always enough. The order felt strange in its mind, awkward, like a limb that has not moved in so long it has half forgotten it is a limb. And some small cold part of Olaf Vey, the part that had found the word unease, noted that strangeness, and understood what it meant. It meant the still keepers were doing something they had forgotten how to do, against a thing they had no drawer for, and that those two facts together were the most dangerous combination a 9 million-year-old mind could face, and that it was already, perhaps, too late. Close on it, Olaf Vey told the 900. Surround the noise. Smother it before it finishes. We will not file this one as a death. We will file it as a silence. The 900 ships began to close. On the slow Mercy, Idris watched them come, and her voice cracked. Captain, they're moving to englobe us. 900 contacts. Closing slow, but closing. If they get a full sphere around us before we fire, they'll have 100 guns on every meter of hull. The cradle won't survive that, and the mantle either. They're not trying to outrun the charge. They're trying to swallow it. Hale watched the sphere begin to form, the ancient ships drifting into a cage of stone around his single broken hull, and he did not change expression. How long until they close it? 6 minutes, maybe less. They're slow, but there's a lot of them, and the gaps are filling. And the coil? 3 minutes 40 to firing floor. Hale did the arithmetic the way he did everything, without drama. The math worked. Barely. The math always worked barely. That was what made it his kind of math. A war was a long column of sums that almost did not add up, and you survived by being the one willing to bet on the almost. Hale was silent for a long moment, watching the sphere fill, watching the ancient ships slide into place around his single broken hull like the closing of a stone hand. He had been in tighter places. He thought he had been in tighter places. He could not, in that moment, actually think of one, but the habit of a long war told him he had, and the habit was enough. A captain does not need to feel calm. A captain only needs to be the one place on the ship where the fear is not allowed to land, and Hale had been that place for 40 years, and he was not going to stop being it now, 6 minutes from the end of everything. Then we don't give them 6 minutes, he said. Toller, all engines, ahead, take us down toward the world. Toller stared at him. Down, Captain? That's into the gravity well. We'll never climb back out of that with these engines. Not under fire, not at the load the cradle's already carrying. If we go down toward the planet, we don't come back up. We're not climbing back out, Hale said. The bridge went very still. Hale turned to face them, all of them, his tired, patched-together crew, and he spoke without anger and without fear, only with the flat certainty of a man who had decided the shape of the thing a long time ago and had simply been waiting for the moment to say it aloud. The mantle has a range, he said. It has to. A force like that bleeds out the further it travels. Fired from up here, in a clean shot across the sphere, it would gut their fleet and scorch their world, and they'd grieve, in their slow way, and in 10,000 years, they'd file us and forget. That's not enough. That gets us our people back if we're lucky, and it lets the still keepers go on being the thing that outlasts everything. They'd lose a fleet and learn nothing. In 1,000 years, they'd build another 900 ships and tell the next angry brief thing the same soft story about how nothing ever made them bleed. He shook his head. I didn't come 9 months across a war to scratch them. I came to teach the oldest thing in the galaxy that there is a clock it can't outlast. And to do that, we put the mantle where it can't bleed out. We put it against the stone. He pointed at the gray world. We crack their planet in half, Hale said. Not their fleet, their world, the drawer they keep everyone in. We dive in close enough that the mantle goes off with the planet's own crust to carry it, and we let 9 million years of patience find out what it feels like to run out of time all at once. Nobody spoke, and then Idris, the young weapons officer, asked the only question that mattered. Our people, she said, the 11,000, they're down there, in the stone. If we crack the world, we crack them too. We came all this way to save them. We can't be the ones who kill them. Hale was quiet for a moment. It was the only moment of the whole engagement when he looked his age. They moved them, he said. 2 hours ago. Long Range took it, and I had it confirmed 3 ways before I'd believe it, because I wasn't going to do this on a guess, not this. The Stillkeepers don't keep prisoners in a place they think might burn. They moved all 11,000 off the homeworld to a holding moon, the far one, the third moon out, before we even arrived, because in their arithmetic, the worst we could do was die loudly near their world, and they wanted their catalog kept safe and tidy while it happened. Something hard came into his voice. They saved our people for us. They moved them out of the blast radius because it never crossed their 9 million year minds that we'd aim for the world and not the fleet. They thought we were brief and angry and a little stupid, and they wanted the drawer clean while we burned. They did our hardest job for us, and they did it out of tidiness. A sound went around the bridge. It was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. So we get them back, Hale said, and we take the world out from under everyone who thought it would stand forever. Both. We do both. That's the whole reason it had to be this ship, this charge, this night. Anything less and we only get one. He turned to the front. Toller, take us down. The slow Mercy turned her patched nose toward the gray planet and fell. On the bridge, the dive changed everything. The world stopped being a thing on a screen and became a wall. A gray wall rising to fill the whole front of the ship, and the patient ships of the Stillkeepers, which had been closing a slow, careful sphere, suddenly found themselves chasing a falling stone into a gravity well their own ships were too vast to follow into. They were 40 kilometers each. They could not dive the way a single small broken hull could dive. They had built themselves enormous, because enormous lasted, and now enormous could not chase the small thing down to the surface, and for the first time the patient sphere began to come apart, ships peeling away from the dive because they could not match it. The great formation that had held for 9 million years breaking up around a single falling ruin. Toller watched it happen and made a sound that was almost a laugh. They can't follow, he said. They're too big. They built themselves to outlast the universe, and they're too big to stop one tug. Hale did not answer. He watched the wall of the world rise, and he counted, in his head, the seconds to the floor, the way he had counted seconds his whole life. The long column of sums that almost did not add up. Down in the magazine, the dive hit Petra like a hand pressing on her whole body. The deck tilted, and the singing in the metal climbed to a shriek, and the first weld let go somewhere forward with a bang like a gun. Pharaoh was already moving, faster than an old man should, throwing himself onto one of the great hand-cranked clamps along the ship's spine. Now, he roared, and his voice carried over everything, over the shriek and the alarms, and the deep climbing hum of the mantle. Now, all of you, on the clamps, hold her together. She's going to try to die. Don't let her. Not yet. Pick a clamp and become it. Forget you're a person. You're a bolt now. You're the bolt that holds the slow Mercy in one piece, and you do not strip, and you do not shear, and you do not let go. Petra threw herself onto the nearest clamp beside Rose, and the two of them hauled on the crank, and the clamp bit down on a bulkhead that was already trying to peel away from its frame. Her burned hands screamed. She did not let go. Up and down the spine of the ship, the magazine crew did the same, 26 of them, ordinary people on hand cranks, becoming the bracing that held a hull around a force that wanted to tear it open from the inside. The work was simple, and it was brutal. You put your whole weight on the crank, and you held, and when the bulkhead bucked you held harder, and there was no skill in it, and no glory in it, only the animal fact of muscle and bone refusing to quit. A second weld blew. A third. The lights flickered and went red. Through the hull Petra could hear the world coming up to meet them, not as a sound but as a pressure, the nearness of something impossibly old and impossibly heavy, the gray stone building the size of a planet swelling to fill everything below. She did not look. She had learned, in 2 years and 1 terrible engagement, that you do not look at the thing that frightens you, when your hands are the only thing standing between the crew and the dark. You look at the clamp. You look at your hands. You hold. 40 seconds to firing floor, Idris called from the bridge, her voice piped down through the screaming ship. Captain, they're firing on us. The sphere's firing. The first hits from the ancient fleet landed on the slow Mercy's stern. They were slow weapons, patient weapons, beams of force that did not flash so much as press, leaning their 9-million-year weight against the little ship's armor. Where they touched, the welded plate did not explode. It aged. Petra watched through a viewport as a whole section of stern hull turned in an instant from metal to rust to dust, decades of corrosion happening in a heartbeat. The Stillkeeper's patience turned into a weapon, the gift of time given all at once until the metal simply forgot how to be metal. A man named Corso had been at a clamp on that section. He was there, and then the section he stood on aged 100 years in a second, and then he was gone with it, and there was no time to grieve, no time even to scream, only the next clamp, and the next break, and the next second of holding. "They're aging the hull," Toller shouted. "They're throwing time at us. That's the weapon. They don't burn, they don't blast, they age. They make 1,000 years happen in a second, and let the metal rot. Then it's a good thing," Hale said, gripping his console as the ship bucked, "that most of this ship is older than they are." It was true, and it was the whole secret, the thing the engineers had bet the mission on 9 months and 40 systems ago. The asteroid that made up half the slow Mercy's body was 4.5 billion years old. The Stillkeepers could throw 1,000,000 years at it and it would shrug, because 1,000,000 years was nothing to a stone that had ridden the dark since before there were stars to ride it under. The patient beams aged the welded human metal to dust, and where they struck the ancient rock they did nothing at all. You cannot rot a stone that has already outweighted the rotting of suns. The crew had built a warship out of the one material older than the oldest thing in the galaxy, and now that choice was the only reason any of them were still alive. The whole forward half of the ship, the rock half, sailing through the patient fire untouched, while the metal half burned away behind them. 30 seconds, Idris called. In those 30 seconds, Petra Quill did the longest work of her life. Each second was its own year. The bulkhead under her clamp bucked, and she held it. The crank bit into her burned palms, and she held it. A spray of sparks came down from the ceiling, where a conduit aged to dust, and she did not flinch, because flinching meant moving, and moving meant the clamp shifted, and the clamp shifting meant the bulkhead behind her opened to the dark. She had stopped thinking in words. She had become a single thought, repeated, the only thought there was, hold. Beside her a younger crewman she had trained with, a boy named Pell only a year older than she was on the clamp 2 spaces down, and she could hear him praying, fast and low, the prayer of the colony they had both come from, and she found that the sound of it helped, the way Ross's flat voice had helped, the way the crude painted flower on the lift had helped, all the small human things that should not have mattered against 900 ancient ships and a world the size of a building, and yet mattered more than anything, because they were the things that let a person hold on for 1 more second, and 1 more second was the whole war. A clamp tore loose 3 spaces down from Petra, and the man on it went with it, and the bulkhead behind him began to peel. Ross let go of her own crank and lunged for it, catching the failing brace with her bare, heavy-whirled hands. holding 2 tons of bulkhead with the strength of a world that made its people strong. Her arms shaking, a sound coming out of her that was not a word. "Petra," she gasped. "Both clamps. You hold both. I've got this one, you hold the other 2. Petra hauled herself between the 2 cranks and took one in each burned hand and pulled, and her whole 15-year-old body became the thing holding 2 pieces of the ship together while a planet swallowed the sky. She weighed nothing. She knew she weighed nothing. It did not matter. She put the nothing she weighed into the cranks and she held, and the bulkheads, which did not know how little she weighed, held with her. At 15 seconds, the patient guns found the bridge. A beam of folded time leaned its weight against the forward armor, and where it touched, the metal aged a century in a heartbeat, and a panel beside Idris's station turned to rust and fell, and the air went thin and cold. Toller's console died under his hands. Half the bridge went dark. And Hale, who had not moved through any of it, simply reached past the dead panel and put his hand flat on the bare ancient rock that showed through where the metal had aged away, the 4.5 billion-year-old stone that the patient gun could not touch, and he felt it, cold and solid and utterly indifferent to time, and something in him steadied that had not even known it was unsteady. The rock did not care that the Still Keepers were 9 million years old. The rock had been old when their world was young. He kept his hand on it. "Hold course," he said. "We're nearly there. The old girl's made of better stuff than they are. Let them throw their centuries. She's got billions." 20 seconds, Idris called. "Captain, the world. We're close enough. Long range confirms the prisoner moon is clear. Well clear. They're safe. All 11,000. The readings are solid. There's nobody in the blast but us and them." Hale closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. In that 1 second he saw every crew he had ever buried, and every crew he had ever brought home, and the column of sums that almost did not add up, and he let it all go. "Then there's nothing left to lose," he said, "and a whole galaxy of old liars left to teach." He opened his eyes. "Take us to the floor. Put the mantle against the crust. And on my word, let it go." Keeper Oloth Ve understood, in the last 10 seconds, exactly what was about to happen, and it was the first time in 9 million years that understanding had come too late to matter. It had watched the broken ship dive. It had not stopped it, because in all its vast experience, nothing dove toward a world it could not hope to reach the surface of. Things that knew they were going to die ran away, or they died fighting the fleet, or they screamed promises into the dark. They did not fall, deliberately, calmly, into the gravity of a planet the size of a building, dragging a sound no one had ever heard, aiming not for the 900 ships, but for the world itself. The fleet had been arranged for 9 million years to stop ships from reaching the world, to land on it, to take it, to hold it. No one had ever come to break it. There was no formation for that. There was no doctrine for that. There had never needed to be. When Oloth Ve understood, it sent one last signal, not to the fleet, to the small thing. "Stop," the Still Keepers said, and the soft, slow voice was not soft anymore. The patience had cracked. Underneath it was a thing that had never once in 9 million years had to ask, "Stop. We will return your 11,000. We will return any number. We will open every drawer in the stone. We will give you the catalog of 140,000 species, every word of every dead people, the whole memory of the galaxy. Anything, anything, only stop. You do not understand what you are about to do. This world is the catalog. Everything we have ever been is written in this stone. Every species we ever outlasted lives only here, in the carving, in the layers, in the deep dark drawers below. If you break it, you do not break a fleet. You do not break a people. You break a memory that is 9 million years deep, the only memory there is of 10,000 peoples who have no other grave. Stop, small thing. We are asking you. We have never asked anything." On the bridge of the Slow Mercy, Hale listened to the oldest thing in the galaxy beg. He did not gloat. That was not in him. But he did not waver either, and the not wavering was its own kind of terrible, because a man who wavers can be talked to, and Hale was past talking. He simply answered, in the plain, flat voice he had used the whole time, the voice of a man who had decided the shape of the thing long ago. "You laughed at us," he said, "an hour ago. You laughed at 11,000 of my people in a drawer, and a broken ship come to get them, because you were sure, the way you've been sure of everything, that you would outlast us and forget our names. You were going to file us." He watched the gray crust swell to fill the entire screen, close enough now to see the canyons, the slow blood of light, the carved layers of 9 million years. Every layer a dead people, every drawer a grave. "You're right that the memory's worth grieving. I'm sorry for the 10,000 peoples in that stone. I am, more than you'll ever believe. But you should have thought of them an hour ago, when you decided 11,000 of mine were a thing to laugh at. You can't keep the whole galaxies dead in a drawer and laugh at the living and expect to do it forever. You were right that you'll forget our names. We're nobody. We're a rust bucket, and a kid in the magazine, and a captain the fleet doesn't talk about. You'll forget all of us." He leaned toward the channel one last time. "But you'll never forget that we were here. That's the difference between us and everything else you outlasted. They wanted to be remembered. We just want to be the thing you can't forget." He turned from the channel. "Idris," he said, "we're at the floor. Let it go." Idris Taro, weapons officer, 23 years old, 3 years out of the academy, on a colony that no longer existed, put her hand on the firing board and pressed it down. Down in the magazine, Petra Quill felt the moment the mantle let go, and there were no words in her for it, then or ever after. The hum that had filled the ship for 10 minutes, the wound coil at the center of the world that was the slow mercy, did not bang, it did not flash, it released. The whole tension of it, the knot of folded force built up turn by turn in the quiet hold, came undone all at once into the gray crust the ship had pressed itself against, and for a single instant the entire planet rang like a struck bell, a note so low and so total that it was not heard but felt in the marrow, in the blood, in the oldest animal part of every mind, for 1,000,000 kilometers in every direction. Petra felt it pass through her body, through her bones, through the 2 clamps she held, and for that instant she was not a person, and not afraid, and not anything, only a thing the great note passed through on its way to the heart of an ancient world. The slow mercy tried to die. Every weld they had not yet held let go at once. The whole stern, already aged to dust by the patient guns, simply ceased. The lights died, and the gravity died, and the air screamed out of 100 new wounds, and the ship bucked like a thing in agony, and Petra was thrown against her clamps and held them anyway, held 2 pieces of the dying ship together with her body, because Faro had told her to, and because letting go had stopped being a thing she knew how to do. The whole spine of the ship flexed, the metal screaming, the rock groaning, and along its length 26 people who had been powder runners that morning became the only thing in the universe standing between the crew and the dark, and they held, and some of them died holding, and the ones who lived would never afterward be able to explain to anyone who had not been there what it was to be a bolt in a ship that the universe was trying to tear in half. Roz went down beside her, pinned under the bulkhead she had saved, 2 tons of metal coming to rest across her legs, and she looked up at Petra and grinned through the blood and said, "We held her. Girl, we held her. Don't you dare let go now." And Petra did not let go. She held the 2 clamps through the worst of it, through the 11 seconds the force took to leave the body of the ship, 11 seconds that were the longest and the shortest of her life at once, 11 seconds in which she was not a girl from a tin colony, but a single point of refusal, in a universe that wanted the ship and everyone in it to come apart. She held when the gravity died, and her feet left the deck, and only her grip on the cranks kept her from flying. She held when a sheet of the ceiling aged to dust, and rained down on her shoulders like gray snow. She held when Pell, 2 spaces down, screamed once and then was quiet, and she could not look, because looking meant letting go, and she had promised something to the ship without ever saying it aloud, the same promise Pharaoh had made, the same promise Ross had made, the only promise that mattered, not yet, not yet. You can come apart, but not yet. Not while there is one more second of holding left in me. And the planet broke under the holding, and the holding did not stop. And the planet broke. It did not shatter like glass. It was too old and too heavy for that. It broke the way a continent breaks, slowly and totally. A single crack racing out from where the mantle had touched it. A line of white fire splitting the gray stone from pole to pole. Faster than the eye could follow and yet somehow slow. Vast, inevitable. The way the end of something enormous always looks slow even when it is faster than thought. And the two halves of the world the size of a building began, with terrible grinding majesty, to part. 9 million years of carved cities, the layered catalogue of 140,000 dead species, the whole patient memory of the still-keepers, came apart along a seam of light, and through the gap poured the molten gold of a heart that had not seen the dark since the world was young, since before the human sun had condensed out of its cloud, since before there was anyone in the whole galaxy to see it. In the still-hold, Keeper Olaf Ve watched the crack race across the face of the world it had been born on, 9 million years before, when the world was already old, and it reached for the catalogue one last time, out of 9 million years of habit, to find the drawer for this, to file the thing that was happening, to give it a name and a place so that the galaxy could turn and the still-keepers could go on. There was no drawer. There had never been a drawer. The catalogue had 10,000 words for endings, and not one of them was this, because this had never happened, because nothing had ever come that did not have time, and the one thing the still-keepers had never catalogued, in all their 9 million years, was a creature that would spend its entire brief life in a single act and count the spending worth it. They had outlasted everything that wanted to live. They had never met a thing that came already willing to be over, that carried its whole short existence to one point and put it down against the stone and let go. The catalogue could not hold it. The catalogue had never been built to hold a thing that did not want to last. The 900 ancient ships did not fire again. They could not. The thing they had been built to defend was coming apart in front of them, and they had no doctrine for it, no plan, no slow, patient answer, because in 9 million years the question had never once been asked. They drifted in their broken sphere, 40 kilometers of stone apiece, 900 of them, the greatest fleet that had ever hung in any sky, and they did nothing, because the only thing they had ever known how to do was wait, and there was nothing left to wait for. Some of them turned, slowly, toward the breaking world, as though to reach it, as though there were anything a ship could do for a planet splitting in half. There was nothing. They had never learned that there could be nothing. In the still hold, on a ship that was still whole, Keeper Olaf Ve watched its world break in half on the deep screens, and it made a sound. It was not a laugh. The still keepers would never laugh again. It was the sound a thing makes when it learns, at the very end of 9 million years, that it had been wrong about the one thing it had been sure of, that time was not the only weapon, that there are things in the dark that do not have time and do not need it, that a brief and broken creature, with 11,000 reasons and a stone in its belly, can do in 11 seconds what patience could never do in 9 million years. It was the sound of certainty dying, and once it started, across 900 ships and a world in 2 pieces, it did not stop. Olaf Ve understood, in that sound, the thing it had laughed at an hour before. It had laughed at a creature that lived 100 years and thought it could matter. It had been so sure that mattering required lasting, that only the long-lived could be real, that the brief were a kind of weather, a thing that happened and passed, and left the stone unchanged. And now the stone was changed. The stone was in 2 pieces and pouring gold into the dark, and the thing that had changed it had lived 100 years and would not even live out this one, and Olaf Ve understood, far too late, that it had had the truth exactly backward for 9 million years. It was not the long-lived who mattered. The long-lived only lasted. Mattering was a different thing entirely. Mattering was what the brief did with the little they were given, the way a star matters most in the instant it dies, the way a single act, chosen and paid for in full, weighs more than 9 million years of patient waiting. The humans had not come to last. They had come to matter. And they had, and the still-keepers never would again, because the only thing they had ever known how to do was wait, and they had finally met the one thing that waiting could not outlast, a creature that did not want to. The slow mercy, what was left of her, fell away from the breaking world. She was dying, there was no question of that. Half her hull was gone to dust, and a third of her crew were dead, and the rest were hurt, and her engines were a memory, and she was tumbling out of the gravity well of a planet that no longer existed in one piece, trailing air and light and pieces of herself across the dark. But the ancient rock that was her spine, the 4.5-billion-year-old stone that the Stillkeeper's patience could not touch, held. It held the magazine, it held the bridge, it held the people clamped to its bones with their burned hands. It carried them, broken and bleeding and alive, up and out, away from the gold and the fire, on the long, slow arc of a thing thrown hard enough to escape, into the clean dark beyond. On the bridge, Hale watched the two halves of the world recede behind them and said nothing for a long time. Toller stood beside him, and Idris sat at her dead board with her hands in her lap, and none of them spoke, because there was nothing yet that words could hold. The bridge was half dark and the air was thin and cold, and they were all of them bleeding from one place or another, and behind them a world that had stood since before the human sun was burning gold into the dark. And they had done it. They had actually done it, and the strange thing, the thing none of them would ever quite be able to explain afterward, was that there was no triumph in it. There was only a vast and quiet weariness. The weariness of people who have carried something too heavy for too long, and have finally set it down, and under the weariness, very deep, a small clean thing that was not joy and was not grief, but was made of both, the feeling of having done the thing you came to do, paid the price you came to pay, and lived, against all reason, to see it finished. Hale put his hand on the bare rock again, the old stone showing through the aged metal, and he left it there, and he let the silence be. Then Hale keyed the ship's intercom, the one that reached every surviving compartment, every clamp, every wounded soul holding the old stone together, and he spoke to all of them at once. "This is the captain," he said. "It's done. The world's broken. Our people on the moon are clear and confirmed, all 11,000, and the fleet's coming for them right now, while the Stillkeepers can't move." He paused, and for the first time in the whole engagement, something in his closed-door voice opened. Just a crack, just enough. "We lost good people tonight. I know their names, and I'll say every one of them when there's time. And there will be time, because we're going home. I asked more of you than any captain has a right to ask, and you gave it, every one of you, the living and the ones who aren't with us now, and I am not going to forget your names, even if the whole galaxy does. We carried something terrible across a war, and we put it where it needed to go, and we held this old girl together long enough to do it. Now we go home. A breath. Hold on a little longer. We're not done holding on yet." Down in the broken magazine, Petra Quill heard it, slumped against her two clamps, her hands ruined, Ross's blood on her sleeve, and Ross breathing beside her, the old asteroid stone humming faintly through the deck, the only part of the ship that was not screaming. She started to cry, not from fear. The fear was gone, burned out somewhere in the last 11 seconds. She cried because she had held on, because she was 15, and she had become the thing that held a ship together, because somewhere out past the broken world, 11,000 people were going home, and she had helped, a powder runner, with no shells left to run, a pet the older ones had tried so hard to keep alive. She cried because Corso was gone, and 4 others on the spine were gone, and Rose's legs were broken under 2 tons of metal, and none of it had stopped. None of it had been allowed to stop, because the holding could not stop until the ship was clear. Pharaoh found her there. He was burned worse than she was, and one arm hung wrong, but his one eye was bright. He had gone down the spine pulling people off failed clamps, alone, with one good arm, while the ship came apart, and he had pulled 4 of them out alive who would have died, and he would never once mention it to anyone. He sat down next to her on the ruined deck, against the old stone, and he did not say anything clever. He just put his good arm around her shoulders, the way you would around a daughter, and the two of them sat in the dark and the cold, and the slow returning hum of a dying ship that would not finish dying, and they watched, through a cracked viewport, the gold light of a broken world grow small behind them. The fleet found them 11 hours later, drifting, dark, and impossibly still alive. The slow Mercy had stopped tumbling by then. The asteroid spine had done what the engineers 2 years and a whole war ago had promised it would do, even though none of them had believed it. It had held. The ancient stone had carried the wreck of the welded human ship out of the dead world's gravity and into a slow drift through clean dark, and there it had waited, leaking the last of its air through patched seams, its crew sealed into the 3 compartments the old rock still wrapped, and it had refused, with the dumb, stubborn patience of something 4.5 billion years old, to come apart the rest of the way. There was a bitter justice in that, and Petra would think about it for the rest of her life. The Still Keepers had worshipped patience, had made it their only god, had outlasted everything, and in the end the thing that beat them was patient too. The oldest stone in the galaxy, patient past their understanding, had simply outlasted the breaking of their world in order to carry 21 human beings home. When the rescue ships came alongside, their crews fell silent at what they saw. They had been told the slow Mercy cracked a planet in half. They had heard it across the whole fleet net, the impossible signal, the world the size of a building splitting along a seam of fire, the 900 ancient ships drifting helpless around the gold wound of a heart laid open. They had cheered. The whole fleet had cheered, every ship in the line, every weary crew, the cheer going out across 40 systems on the long warband until even the colonies heard it and wept. And now they came alongside the thing that had done it, expecting a warship, and they found a smoking gray rock with half a hull, scorched to the bone, trailing dust, with 21 people clamped to its spine with their bare hands, alive. The first thing the rescue teams found, when they cut their way in, was a 15-year-old girl asleep against a hand-cranked clamp, with an old man's arm around her, the both of them holding a bulkhead that no longer needed holding, because somewhere in the long dark drift they had stopped being afraid to let go and had simply not let go anyway, out of habit, out of stubbornness, out of the same animal refusal that had carried the whole ship home. They found Roz nearby with her legs splinted in conveyor parts that Pharaoh had fashioned with one hand in the dark, alive, awake, refusing the stretcher until every other wounded soul was off the ship first. They found the captain on the bridge, in his chair, his hands folded, watching the dark where the world had been, and he did not turn around when they came for him. He said only, "Get the wounded off. There are 21 of us. There were 26 this morning. Mind the difference. Mind it carefully." For 2 days, before she woke, Petra Quill drifted in and out of a place that was not quite sleep, and not quite waking, and in that place she was still on the spine, still holding the 2 clamps, and she could not make her hands let go, even though there was nothing left to hold. The medics had to talk her hands open, 1 finger at a time, twice, before the burns could be treated, because even unconscious she would not release her grip. They said afterward that they had seen it before, in people who had held something past the end of their strength, that the body learns the holding so deeply it forgets there was ever a before, and it takes time, and gentleness, and a voice telling you over and over that it is finished. You can let go now, it is finished. A nurse named Brindle sat with her through the worst of it, holding her wrapped hands and saying those words, "It is finished, you can let go," until somewhere in the dark Petra believed her, and her hands opened, and she slept a real sleep at last. Petra Quill woke up in a clean bed 3 days later, on a fleet carrier, with her hands wrapped and her siblings' faces on a screen above her, all 8 of them, crying and shouting at once, the youngest of them holding the screen so close that all Petra could see was one enormous, tearful eye. She had been promoted. She did not understand the rank and did not care about it. She asked the same question over and over of every nurse and every officer who came near her, until somebody finally brought her the answer. The 11,000 were home. Every one. The holding moon, the 3rd moon out, had been clear, just as Hale's long range had sworn, and while the Still Keepers drifted in the wreck of their certainty around a broken world, the human fleet had moved in, and taken every last colonist off that moon, 11,140 souls, and carried them out, mothers and minors and old men and children. 11,000 people who had been filed in a drawer in the stone by a thing that thought it would outlast them all, and who were now going home to a war that was, somehow, against all the long patient arithmetic of the galaxy, a little closer to over. They told Petra that the Stillkeepers had not fired a shot since. Not at the rescue fleet, not at anyone. The 900 ancient ships still hung around the two halves of their broken world, and they did nothing, because the only thing they had ever known how to do was wait, and the thing they had waited 9 million years to protect was in pieces, and there was no patience deep enough to outlast that. The war on the other fronts had not ended that day, but it had bent. Other ancient empires that had allied themselves with the Stillkeepers, that had laughed along with them, looked at the two halves of that world drifting in the dark and went very quiet, and some of them, in the months after, sent the first messages they had ever sent that were not demands. The fleet held a service, in the weeks after, for the dead of the slow mercy. There were 5 of them. Corso, who had been at the stern clamp when the patient guns aged the metal out from under him. Pell, the boy who had prayed 2 spaces down from Petra, only 16, who had held his clamp through the firing and through the breaking and let go only when there was nothing left to hold. And 3 others, all of them magazine crew, all of them ordinary people who had thought their war that night would be carrying shells and who had become bolts in a dying ship instead, and held. The names were read out on the fleet band so that every ship in 40 systems heard them, because the admiral had decided that the people who broke a 9-million-year empire would not go unnamed even if the galaxy forgot everything else. Petra sat through it in a wheelchair, her hands still wrapped, and she did not cry, because she had cried already, all of it, in the dark of the drifting wreck. She only listened to the names, and she held each one in her mind the way she had held the clamps, and she promised, again, without saying it aloud, that she would not let them go either. A signal had come, once, in those days, one signal, from the stillhold to the human fleet. It was not a threat, and it was not an offer. It was 3 words, translated and passed quietly up and down the line until every human in the war had heard them. The 3 words, the oldest thing in the galaxy had sent, after a brief and broken creature cracked its world in half. "We remember you," the Stillkeepers said. And then they went silent, and they have been silent since. Petra thought about that for a long time, in the clean bed, with her wrapped hands and her siblings' faces. She thought about the soft, amused voice that had laughed at them from 900 ships and a world the size of a building. She thought about how sure it had been. She thought about the sound it had made at the end, the sound of certainty dying, and how it had not been a thing she enjoyed hearing, even after everything. She was 15. She had wanted them to be monsters, because monsters are easy. They had not been monsters. They had been old and proud and so certain of their own forever that they had laughed at the one thing that could end it. And they had kept the only graves of 10,000 dead peoples in their stone, and those graves were gone now too, and that was a weight she had not asked for and would carry anyway, because the captain had carried it, and she had seen his face when he said he was sorry, and she had understood that you could be right and still be carrying something terrible, and that the carrying was the price of the rightness, and that grown people paid it without complaint. That was worse than monsters, somehow. That was a kind of warning she did not have the words for yet, but would carry for the rest of her life. Captain Edric Hale came to see her before they transferred her off the carrier. He looked the same as he always had, the closed-door face, the folded hands, except that he stood a little differently now, the way a man stands when he has set down a thing he carried across a war and is not yet used to the lightness. He sat by her bed. He did not say anything clever either, the way Pharaoh had not. "You held the spine," he said finally. 2 clamps. I read the after action. The bracing on the dorsal magazine failed in 9 places, and you and the heavy world gunner held the 2 that would have opened the whole compartment to the dark. Everyone forward of you, 11 people in the forward magazine, would have died in the first 3 seconds. He looked at her wrapped hands. You were the youngest person on my ship, and you were one of the reasons the rest of us are alive. I have commanded a great many people in a great many years. I have rarely owed any of them more than I owe you." Petra did not know what to say to that. She was 15. "I didn't do anything," she said. "I just didn't let go." Hale was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "That's the whole thing. That was always the whole thing. The Stillkeepers thought they'd won the war against everyone who ever came for them, because they could outlast anything. They could wait until the angry thing got tired and old and let go." He stood up, and then a 15-year-old in their magazine didn't let go. "That's all it ever was. That's the only weapon we ever really had. The mantle just made it loud enough for them to notice. People have a word for what we did out there. They're calling it a great weapon, a great strategy, a great captain. It wasn't any of those things. It was a crew of tired people who would not let go of a ship, around a girl who would not let go of 2 clamps. Everything else was decoration." He went to the door. Then he stopped and turned back, and for the first and only time, Petra Quill saw Captain Edric Hale almost smile. "They'll remember us," he said. "The oldest thing in the galaxy is going to spend the rest of its very long life remembering 1 rust bucket and 1 girl who wouldn't let go. I think that's worth more than being forgotten gently." He nodded to her, once, the way you nod to an equal. "Heal up, Gunner. The war's not over, but it's better than it was, and you're the reason." Then he was gone. There was talk, in the years that followed, of building more mantle ships, now that the galaxy had seen what one could do. The admirals argued about it in rooms Petra was never in. But the talk always died, and it always died for the same reason, and the reason was the thing the captain had said to her in the clean white room. The mantle was never the weapon. The mantle was loud, but the weapon was the crew, and you cannot build a crew. You cannot manufacture 26 people who will become bolts in a dying ship and hold. You can only find them, here and there, on tin colonies and heavy worlds, in magazines and on rock tugs, and bring them together in the dark, and hope. The fleet built no more mantle ships. It decided, in the end, that the thing that had broken the Stillkeepers was not a weapon to be made twice, but a thing that had happened once, the way certain things happen once, and that the right way to honor it was to remember it, and not to try to repeat it. Petra always thought that was the wisest decision the fleet ever made, and the most human, and she was proud, in a quiet way, that her ship had been the reason for it. The story of the Slow Mercy traveled the way the best stories travel, faster than any ship, ahead of the official reports, in the mouths of crews on 100 worlds. By the time Petra was out of the wheelchair, children on colonies she had never visited were playing a game where one of them was the Rust Bucket and the rest were the 900 ancient ships, and the Rust Bucket always won, and the children always laughed at the part where the old ones laughed first, because they knew, the way children always know, that the laughing was the mistake. There was a song, after a while. There were several songs. Petra heard one of them in a transit station 2 years after, sung badly by a drunk dock worker who had no idea the girl from the song was sitting 6 feet away with her white scarred hands wrapped around a cup, and she did not tell him, because the song had grown bigger than her by then, the way these things do, and it did not belong to her anymore, and she found she did not mind. The song got most of it wrong. It made the captain 10 feet tall and the ship a gleaming dreadnought, and left out the bucket she had been sick into and the crude painted flower on the lift. But it got the important part right. It got the part about not letting go. That was the only part that had ever mattered, and the drunk dock worker sang it with his whole heart, and Petra drank her drink and listened and did not say a word. Petra Quill served 3 more years. She was there when the war ended, on a quiet morning over a colony world that had never expected to see one, and she lived a long, ordinary life after it, and she had children of her own, and a small house on a world with real oceans, the first oceans she had ever seen, because a girl from a tin colony never forgets the first time water goes all the way to the horizon. When her children were old enough, she told them about the slow rust bucket and the thing in its belly, and the world that broke in half. She told them about Pharaoh and his metal jaw, who lived to be very old, and never once spoke of the 4 people he pulled off the spine with one good arm. She told them about Roz, who walked again, slowly, on heavy world legs that the surgeons said should never have walked, and who came to every reunion the crew ever held and lifted the youngest child present over her head each time, laughing. She told them about Idris Tarot, who pressed the board, and who carried that for the rest of her life too, and who became a teacher and was gentle with frightened students in a way her own captain had taught her without ever meaning to. She told them about the captain the fleet didn't talk about, who buried more crews and brought home more crews than any officer in the war, and who died in his sleep at a great age in a small room, with the after-action report of the Slow Mercy folded in a drawer beside his bed, where he could reach it. She told them about the Slow Mercy herself, too, because the ship had a fate, and it was a good one. They did not scrap her. There had been a move to scrap her, early on, when the war was still going and metal was short, and a half-dead tug, with one good half, was worth more melted down than kept. But the crew had refused, all of them, every survivor, and they had been heroes by then, and the fleet could not very well melt down the hero's ship, and so instead they towed her home, the rock half of her, the 4.5-billion-year-old spine that the patience of the Stillkeepers could not touch, and they set her in orbit over the colony that the 11,000 had been taken from, the colony she had crossed a war to save. And there she hung, a gray stone with a flower painted somewhere deep inside her on the wall of a lift, turning slowly above a world of people who owed her their lives, and on certain nights, the colonists said, you could see her catch the light, an old broken thing that had outlasted the oldest empire in the galaxy, kept not because she was useful, but because some things you keep, simply because of what they did. Petra visited her once, years later, an old woman by then, and went aboard, and found the lift, and the flower, faded now but still there, and she put her white scarred hand against it, the way she had every shift of her young life, and she stood for a long time in the quiet of the ship that had carried her home, and she did not cry, because she had cried already, all of it, long ago, in the dark. And she told them last of all about the 3 words the old ones sent. When her children asked her, the way children do, whether she had been afraid, she always told them the truth. Every second, she said, I was the most afraid person on that ship. I was sick into a bucket before we even fired. She would hold up her old scarred hands then, the burns long healed to white lines, and turn them in the light. But being afraid was never the thing. The Stillkeepers were never afraid of anything, and they're the ones who lost. The thing that wins isn't the one that isn't scared. It's the one that's scared out of its mind and holds the clamp anyway. Anyone can be brave when they're sure. The whole trick of being a person is being terrified, and being the one holding the bulkhead and not letting go. Far away, around the 2 drifting halves of a broken world, 900 ancient ships still hang in the dark, silent, patient, with nothing left to be patient for. The gold has cooled in the wound of the planet to a long, dark seam, and the carved cities of 9 million years drift apart a little further with each turning, a memory coming slowly to pieces in the cold, the only graves of 10,000 dead peoples opening at last to the dark they had been kept from for so long. And sometimes, the human ships that pass that place on the long, quiet routes report a single signal, weak and old and endlessly repeating, broadcast into the dark by a thing that used to be sure it would outlast everything that ever lived. It is 3 words. It has never changed. We remember you. They always will.